Leopard 2 tanks and UAVs probe Russian defenses. Trenches crisscross the landscape for hundreds of miles. Artillery and missiles fly across the front lines in both directions. These are the events unfolding in Ukraine as Ukraine's offensive to take back their home begins. But can they succeed? Russia has vast reserves of resources and men. They've spent months preparing for the upcoming offensive, and the West has dragged its feet in delivering many of the weapons and supplies Ukraine desperately needs. The success of the offensive is contingent on 5 things. Let's find out what they are. In recent weeks, Vladimir Putin has gone on national television and announced we can definitely state that this Ukrainian offensive has begun. And for once, he would be right. Ukraine has indeed started its offensive, but in many ways, the operation has been going on for weeks. Ukraine has been conducting shaping operations by firing long-range missiles and artillery at Russian targets far behind the front lines. This is done to weaken the Russian command structure and logistical capabilities. More recently, Ukraine has been sending small groups of tanks and armored vehicles into Russian-occupied territory. These units are not trying to break through Russian defenses or secure the region, but are instead probing their enemy's defenses in order to find weak spots that can be exploited down the road. This is known as the fighting reconnaissance stage of the offensive, and it's happening all across the front lines. It's only a matter of time before Ukrainian forces find an entry point and push through. But there is more that needs to happen besides just crossing the front lines if this offensive is to succeed. The only way that Ukraine will view the operation as a victory is if they can reclaim all of its stolen lands from Russia, including Crimea. Since Putin's reign over Russia would likely come to an end if this were to happen, entry points into the Crimean Peninsula will likely be some of the most heavily fortified areas in the entire region. If Ukrainian forces are able to secure Crimea, the war would be all but over. But first things first, the Ukrainian offensive will take time. This is because Russia has spent months preparing for this day. They've dug trenches, created vast minefields, and deployed anti-armor obstacles. The first thing Ukraine needs to do is penetrate the defenses and move men and supplies into Russian-occupied areas that they seize. Then they must protect whatever land they secure from Russian counterattacks. This may not be difficult for reasons that we'll get into in a bit, but before a push toward Crimea can be made, Ukraine must take back the southern parts of their country. Even if Ukraine manages to take most of its territory back, the war still won't be over. President Zelensky and Ukrainian officials have made it very clear the only way they will stop fighting is if all of Ukraine's land is returned, including Crimea. Even if Ukraine's offensive is largely successful, the war itself will last much longer. However, until the offensive plays out, what comes next is unknown. In order for Ukraine's offensive to succeed, they need to leverage 5 things: modern Western weapons, technology, and vehicles, their superior training, the extensive nature of the front line, the high morale of their soldiers, and the Ukrainian people's resourcefulness. Ukraine has all 5 of these things going for them, but it's important that they're used in tandem to ensure success in the offensive. Before we analyze how each one of these factors could benefit Ukraine in the coming months, let's look at what's standing in Ukraine's way, in particular the vast network of defenses that Russia's constructed during the winter and spring months. When the cold weather of the winter began to roll into Eastern Europe and the fighting slowed, the Russian military took advantage of the lull to start constructing a massive amount of defenses. Everyone, including Russia, knew that when the ground thawed and the weather became warmer, Ukraine would be launching an offensive. During this break in fighting, Ukraine sent soldiers to be trained by NATO personnel on how to best use the Leopard 2 tanks that would be delivered. These military vehicles will play a pivotal role in the offensive to come. Rather than training their new conscripts adequately or taking a good hard look at how their forces have fared thus far in the war, Moscow decided to fall back on its favorite tactic of throwing a lot of men and resources at a problem in hopes that something will happen. In this case, Russian soldiers, construction workers, and contractors were tasked with building a series of trenches and fortifications that would counteract all of the training and new vehicles that Ukraine would use to launch their offensive in the summer months. Some are now calling what the Russians have built the most formidable defensive fortifications in the world. But this is probably an exaggeration, as the effectiveness of its defenses has yet to be tested. Russian minefields, concrete tank obstacles known as Dragon's Teeth, artillery impact zones, and trenches stretch across Ukraine from east to west. The problem the Ukrainian offensive faces is that Russia has time to create a multi-layered defense structure that consists of static defenses, motorized rifle battalions, and artillery. Each battalion is responsible for an area approximately 3 to 5 kilometers wide and 2 to 2.5 kilometers deep. This works out to around 4 square miles. A good example of the defensive structures that have been implemented by Russia can be seen outside the town of Mykolivka. Here, Russians have enacted a 4-layered approach. 1.24 miles or 2 kilometers from the town, deep trenches have been dug to hinder the movement of Ukrainian vehicles. 1,600 feet or 500 meters behind that, there's a barrier of dragon's teeth that, when properly deployed, can stop a Leopard 2 tank in its tracks. The concrete barriers are set up in 3 different rows and will slow Ukrainian forces down when they get past the initial trenches. Another 820 feet or 250 meters behind the Dragon's Teeth wall is a trench system that's designed to house infantry and provide them with suitable protection against the oncoming forces. It's likely that the men in these trenches will be armed with anti-tank missiles and rocket-propelled grenades to attack and disable Ukrainian armor. The Russian soldiers would also be supplemented by snipers and machine gunners to fire upon any Ukrainian soldiers who are advancing with the tanks or engineers that are deployed to repair damaged equipment. The infantry trenches would be used to hold the incoming Ukrainian forces at bay, while artillery and aircraft could provide support and decimate the bogged-down offensive units from a distance. The final layer of defense is another set of counter-mobility barriers, such as ditches, more Dragon's Teeth, and another trench for the Russian infantry to fall back to. It's here where Russian tanks and vehicles could also be stationed to launch a counterattack. The trenches here might also be used as command positions, along with providing supporting fire for the men located closer to the oncoming attack. As a last resort, this final trench may be used to provide covering fire as Russian forces retreat when Ukrainian forces overrun their defenses. The artillery support would be much further away from these defensive lines to allow for plenty of time to reposition or pull back. However, when the Ukrainian forces are slowed by the numerous obstacles, trenches, and Russian soldiers, shells will continuously rain down on their position. This is a key part of the Russian defense. The structures built don't necessarily have to stop Ukrainian forces, they just need to slow them down so there's a better chance of Russian artillery and missiles connecting with their targets. Most analysts agree that even though the Russian defense structure seems to be sound, incompetent leaders and unskilled conscripts will likely not be able to use them effectively. Although it is worth noting that in the first phase of the Ukrainian offensive, a newly delivered Leopard 2 tank was destroyed by a Russian artillery ambush without getting a single shot off. This was not a full-blown attack by the Ukrainians and was likely only a reconnaissance mission to find weak spots in the Russian lines. But it does go to show that Ukraine still needs to be cautious, as the Russians still have a massive amount of firepower, and Ukrainian forces only have a limited number of Western tanks at their disposal. Now let's look at the 5 things that will help Ukraine succeed in its offensive. It's highly probable that Ukraine will break through the Russian defenses at some point, and even though they are still vastly outnumbered, Ukraine could secure a tremendous victory in the coming months, and these are the reasons why. Number 1. Ukraine has modern Western weapons, technology, and vehicles. It's clear from the initial invasion that the Russian military was not ready to fight against modern weapons wielded by dedicated and skilled Ukrainian soldiers. In fact, new reports suggest that Russia has lost at least 2,001 tanks since the beginning of the war. Putin and his associates believed they would roll into Kyiv, be welcomed with open arms, and the war would end. Obviously, this is not what happened. Instead, Russia finds itself in the second year of a war that they are losing badly, staring down the barrel of a Ukrainian offensive. Offensives normally require an army to be highly mobile. This is why tanks and armored transports are so vital to an offensive initiative. It's estimated that countries backing Ukraine have sent around 1,550 combat vehicles and 230 tanks, most of which were from the Soviet era. However, at least 21 Leopard 2s have been delivered, with around 80 or more still to come. The United States is also sending Ukraine 31 M1A2 Abrams. The problem is that all these tanks will arrive after the offensive has already begun. The tanks and armored vehicles Ukraine does have will allow them to outmaneuver and penetrate Russian defenses. Once Ukrainian forces identify a weak spot that will allow them to infiltrate Russian-held territory, things will quickly spiral out of control for Russia. The modern Western tanks are stronger, more durable, and faster than anything Russia currently has on the battlefield. The key for Ukraine is to make good decisions and not get trapped in an artillery kill zone, which is another reason why mobility will be so important in the coming offensive. Most armored vehicles that NATO has sent to Ukraine will be able to withstand a direct hit without killing everyone inside. This is vital to protecting the much smaller troop numbers that Ukraine has compared to Russia's massive conscript army. The Western armored transports will play a pivotal role in getting troops to where they need to go as safely and quickly as possible. The same cannot be said about Russian transports that have been picked off and decimated by Western anti-tank and anti-armor weapons that Ukraine wielded at the beginning of the conflict. It's weapons like the US-made Javelin that are the reason why so many Russian tanks and armored vehicles have been destroyed. Ukraine also has the benefit of Western unmanned aircraft systems that allow for exceptional reconnaissance for combined arms warfare tactics. Combined arms warfare is a strategy that modern militaries use to ensure every unit in an attack has support. Soldiers are protected by armored carriers and tanks while providing reciprocal support for those units. Aircraft provide intel and cover from above. Combined arms tactics are used as a multi-pronged approach that utilizes multiple branches of the military. This allows for more effective combat operations, which is why analysts were shocked when Russia did not employ combined arms operations at the beginning of the war. This is another reason why their tanks and armor were so vulnerable. The unmanned aircraft systems Ukraine has received from the West and is utilizing in the offensive to identify targets such as artillery positions are incredibly important for the success of the mission. They're also being used for damage assessments and information gathering. And of course, the UAVs are perfect for spotting gaps in the Russian lines that can be exploited. All of these things are vital to the success of the Ukrainian offensive. Without the modern weapons, vehicles, and equipment being sent to Ukraine by the West, the offensive would have a much lower chance of success. But as long as Ukraine continues to operate with precision and modern tactics, their skill will only be complemented by Western equipment that they already have. Number 2. Ukrainian forces have been trained well. As Russia showed the world at the beginning of the war, numbers aren't everything. Even though the Russian military vastly outnumbered Ukrainian forces, they could not defeat them. This is partly because of the NATO training that Ukraine's military leaders and soldiers received. Conversely, Russia had sent undertrained and inexperienced soldiers into combat, and the results speak for themselves. While Russia was digging trenches and setting up defenses all winter, Ukrainians were receiving further training on how to use the Leopard 2 tanks and tactics that will aid in their offensive. The unfortunate part for Russia is that during their invasion they lost a lot of their seasoned veterans and had to rely heavily on conscripts and hired mercenaries like the Wagner Group. This is because Russian forces suffered from poor military leadership, ineffective joint operations, and faulty Federal Security Service intelligence and planning. So, when push comes to shove, well-trained Ukrainian troops will be able to beat practically any force that Russia can throw at them. The training that Ukrainian troops and military leaders are receiving has set them up to launch a successful offensive. They'll hit Russian weak points hard and fast, where unskilled soldiers will not be able to mount a proper defense. Right now, Russia has around 70 combat regiments and brigades in Ukraine. However, only a fraction of the men in those units have had adequate combat training or have been in a battle before. This means mistakes will be made, which the well-trained Ukrainian soldiers will be more than happy to exploit. The other problem Russia faces with its poorly trained soldiers is that they won't have enough competent troops to fill the gaps in their defensive lines. An even bigger problem will be that Russian forces won't be able to launch successful counterattacks to provide their units time to regroup and push back any Ukraine tanks and soldiers that make it past their defenses. It's also worth noting that untrained soldiers are not the only problem Russia faces during the Ukrainian offensive. Although the Russian defenses look formidable, this might be deceiving. It's been uncovered that many of the defensive fortifications were dug and built by contractors who had little to no military engineering experience. This lack of expertise may have resulted in fortifications that are completely inadequate to repel the incoming Ukrainian offensive. Recent photos of Russian defenses have brought their effectiveness into question. For example, some of Russia's Dragon's Teeth seem to have been improperly set up, likely due to a lack of training or military knowledge of the contractors who were installing them. Dragon's Teeth should be connected to one another underground and partially buried. Instead, some Dragon's Teeth are just sitting on the surface, rendering them ineffective. Also, these defenses are supposed to be made entirely of concrete in order to damage or entangle any tank or vehicle trying to go through them. However, images have appeared in the media of crumbling Dragon's Teeth that were poorly made of inadequate materials and are already deteriorating due to environmental factors. It may only be a matter of time before the Ukrainian forces find a faulty barricade or a shoddily built defense structure that allows them to pass through enemy lines easily. And it's almost a guarantee that the training Ukrainian forces have received from NATO, including ways to exploit Russian weaknesses, will play a major role in the operations to come. Number 3. The extensive expanse of the front line works in Ukraine's favor. Russian soldiers and artillery cannot be everywhere all at once or cover every entry point along the front lines. This is why the massive front line that extends all the way across the country works in Ukraine's favor when launching an offensive. The front line is around 621 miles or 1,000 kilometers long. which is more than double the length of the Maginot Line that Nazi Germany smashed through at the start of World War II. It should come as no surprise that defending a long front line is much more difficult than defending a narrow front with choke points. With all of Russia's failures and lack of adequately trained soldiers, there is no way that the entirety of the front line can be monitored or protected at all times. Once the Ukrainian offensive pierces through initial Russian defenses, even just at a single point, it'll allow them to get behind the enemy and encircle them. The Russians will then be trapped while they struggle to fight off Ukrainians in modern tanks closing in on all sides. Once past the front line of defenses, there's a massive amount of unguarded territory that Ukraine can utilize to deploy its forces across the landscape. The Russians have put all of their eggs in one basket. They heavily fortified a single stretch of land, hoping Ukrainian troops won't get behind them. But when they do, because they will find a way, Russian forces will be in big trouble. It's thanks to this vast amount of territory that Russia is trying to defend that the Ukrainian offensive will be successful in the coming months. However, once Russian forces fall back to the land bridge connecting the Crimean Peninsula to the rest of Ukraine, things will become a little more difficult. This is a true choke point and a location that Russian forces will defend to the last man. New tactics will need to be implemented when Ukraine gets to this stage of the offensive, as any full-on assault into the Crimean Peninsula will result in a massive amount of casualties on both sides. In terms of the current front lines, Ukraine also has an advantage due to the fact that at least some of the soldiers will be familiar with the region, since it was either once their home or they've spent time in the area. This familiarity with the terrain, roads, and strategic natural features will only increase the chances of a successful offensive. Number 4. Ukrainian morale is much higher than Russian morale. For starters, Ukrainians are fighting to take back their country from an invader. Russians are fighting to hold on to the territory that Vladimir Putin refuses to give up because it'll make him look weak. These are two very different reasons for fighting. And it's no surprise that Ukrainian soldiers have much higher morals than conscripts and mercenaries fighting for Moscow. There's a sense of nationalism amongst Ukrainians as everyone, no matter their views, have been unified by a common enemy. This has led to Ukrainian soldiers fighting harder, longer, and without complaint for Ukraine free of Russian oppression. But this feeling extends beyond just the soldiers. Ukrainian civilians have been incredibly resilient and helped with the war effort any way they can. Food and shelter are offered to soldiers. First aid and medical professionals treat wounded civilians and fighters alike. When Putin launched the invasion of Ukraine, it was under the pretense that Ukraine belonged to Russia and that the Ukrainian people wanted to be under the leadership of Moscow. Over a year later, it's clear that Ukrainians want to remain independent and will fight to the bitter end to achieve the goal. When this determination is combined with training, weapons, and tanks that Ukraine is using to launch its offensive, it's going to be very difficult for Russian forces to stop them. Also, it should come as no surprise that the opposite is happening on the Russian ranks. There is no clear unifying mentality other than being forced to fight a war that has no purpose. This has led to Russian soldiers having extremely low morale, which has led to more and more men abandoning the war and seeking asylum in other countries. Russian court records indicate that the number of absences without leave or AWOL cases has increased. In fact, the number of AWOL cases in the first 4 months of 2023 already exceeded the total number of cases in 2022. This isn't entirely surprising, as the brutal Ukrainian winter, constant long-range attacks, and inadequate training likely led conscripts who were deployed to the front lines to jump ship before the coming offensive could begin. This begs the question, do the Russian soldiers on the front lines know how poorly their defenses will hold up against the coming offensive? The number of AWOL cases may be due to a mix of low morale in the Russian ranks and the fear of being crushed under Ukrainian tanks and troops when the offensive fully commences. Number 5. Ukraine has shown resourcefulness and flexibility throughout the war and will continue to do so in the coming offensive. By nature, an offensive must have well-trained commanders leading the effort who can also be flexible and adjust to rapidly changing conditions. Ukrainian leadership and soldiers have shown they have the ability to do this from day one, whether it's defending their capital from a Russian onslaught or stealing and repurposing Russian tanks. The Ukrainian military has dealt with anything the enemy can throw at them. In the coming weeks and months, Ukrainian forces will need to continue to be adaptable as they probe Russian defenses and find the perfect location and moment to strike. Throughout the conflict, Ukrainian decisions at the platoon, company, and battalion levels have been far superior to their Russian counterparts. This is because of their willingness to improvise and switch tactics while maintaining discipline and falling back on their training. It's almost inevitable that the resourcefulness of the Ukrainian military will end up providing an opportunity to break through the Russian line and decimate their defenses. It wasn't too long ago that Russia held a significant amount of territory in Ukraine. However, as winter approached, Ukrainian forces took back town after town, kicked Russian troops out of entire territories, and pushed them all the way back to the southernmost regions of the country. All of this was done using limited supplies, limited weapons, and limited help from the West. What this means is that the Ukrainian offensive will likely be reminiscent of the battles that pushed Russian forces so far south. Ukrainian leaders and soldiers will use their resourcefulness to exploit weaknesses in the Russian defenses, which will inevitably lead to a successful Ukrainian offensive in the coming months. But the offensive is not without its own challenges. Other than the Russians digging in, Ukraine has been struggling to procure some key assets from the West that would aid in their push south. The whole mission would be much easier if Ukraine had access to more powerful aircraft, such as the F-16. Kyiv has continuously asked Western nations to supply them with aircraft to protect their skies and aid in the push forward, but the United States and its allies have dragged their feet thus far. Supposedly F-16s will be sent at some point, but the Ukrainian offensive cannot wait until they arrive, which will put troops and armor in more danger than they would be if Ukraine had more aircraft. So, what happens next? The success of the Ukrainian offensive hinges on their ability to maintain flexibility while utilizing their training and making informed decisions about when to attack. These things will be possible thanks to key Western weapons and equipment such as modern tanks, UAVs, and hopefully M1 Abrams and F-16s that have been promised the Ukrainian military. Even without these promises being fulfilled, the Ukrainian offensive will likely succeed due to the high morale of their troops and the resourcefulness of the Ukrainian people. However, when the offensive breaks the Russian defensive line, it's likely that Russian forces will pull back further and further south toward the Crimean Peninsula. Even if the first stages of the offensive are successful, there is still a long road to victory. Vladimir Putin will order his men to defend the crossing into Crimea at all costs. It's not out of the realm of possibility that when Ukrainian troops break the Russian line, Putin will start spewing his previous threats of deploying tactical nukes to Ukraine as a way to deter Ukrainian forces. Can the Ukrainian offensive succeed? Absolutely. Will it? Most likely. But war is far from over, and if Ukraine has any hope of taking back all of its territory, including Crimea, the rest of the world needs to continue to support them and punish Vladimir Putin's Russia for invading their neighbor. Now watch ex-CIA agent breaks down why Putin is in trouble, or check out why Putin is scared to deploy the Su-57 aircraft in Ukraine.